Yes, this is Stephen Sloan. The date is September 14th, 2011. I'm with Mr. Wilson, Reverend Wilson Canafax, here on Randall Mill Road at his facility, the Church of Christ. What's the name of it?
Lakewood Retirement Center.
Lakewood Retirement Center. And this is an interview with the Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission's Texas Liberators project. Reverend Canafax, thank you for sitting down with me today.
Glad to do it.
I would love to start. We talked just a little bit earlier about where you were from. If we can begin there, and you talk a little bit about your childhood and your family and that sort of thing.
Well, I was born in the town of Millsap. My father was the station agent for the railroad that went through Millsap at that time. My mother became ill, and Dad moved to the family, and I was the last of 4 children, 3 of whom were living. Dad moved to Dallas to get my mother near medical help, and but she died, and so I was brought up in the city of Dallas, and Dad had a hard time. His work was 7 days a week, and ironically, he had no way of transportation, so he walked 3 miles to and 3 miles from his work every day. So you add that up on 35 years, and you see how much he walked. And he never weighed over 125 pounds, walked all of his weight off. But my grandmother, our grandmother, was the one who came into the home to look after us and see that we had clean clothes, and if we had patched clothes, they were still clean. And she got us off to school every day. In fact, the last 6 years of my public school education, I didn't miss a class, nor was I tardy. Now, that's impossible today. But I did it, and I was glad I could. I got special recognition for it, and that was okay. And I graduated from high school at Woodrow Wilson High in Dallas. I was a pretty good wildcat, that's what they were. And I came to, heard there was a school in Fort Worth where you could get a job, go to school. So I came over and I found a job working. And my grandmother, who had brought me up, had no place to go. So I took her with me to college, and we literally stayed there together for 4 years in an apartment. She looked after my food, my clothing, and everything else, and made me ready for school every day like she had been when I was in high school. And I finished Texas Wesleyan. I came to SMU Seminary in Dallas, part of the school system there. And I was just an average student. I was a pretty good guy, but an average student. And the war was going on, and they were needing chaplains. And so I guess out of patriotism or whatever, I told them I'd be ready to go if it could use me, and they said yes. So I was sent to Fort Devens, Massachusetts for training. And it was not a lengthy training, but it was there, and I was there during the winter time, and it gets cold in the interior of Massachusetts, I can tell you. Texas light blood going up there, it was cold. And I was given an assignment from there to the parachute school at Fort Benning, Georgia. And I appreciated that. I was working with men who were under risk, but I was not a jumper. I was getting ready to be. And they said, we need you more elsewhere. So they picked me up and sent me to Europe. And I stayed in a depot in Belgium a few weeks, I think 3 weeks, near the little town of Dolhain, D-O-L-H-A-I-N. And so then they assigned me to the 11th Engineer Combat Group. which was up in the middle part of Germany. And that's where I met my group, and they received me with genuine appreciation and friendship. And it wasn't long till they gave me a promotion from a second lieutenant to a captain, from a first lieutenant to a captain. So I was there when the war ended. I was there at Marburg, Marburg. And having been over there such a brief time, they said, we want you to stay and do some chaplaincy work, okay? So they sent me down to Stuttgart. And I was at Stuttgart for a while. And from Stuttgart, I was sent up to Frankfurt, headquarters chapel at Frankfurt. I enjoyed that. The bigwigs were there, and you had a chance to, if possible, to be of service to them. But there I was, a young chaplain who was still green behind the ears, trying to be a chaplain to those four-star people. And the proximity wasn't too close, but I enjoyed doing that. And then stayed and did that work until they began to disperse troops and send them home. So I came home and got started in my work. So I had finished seminary, and of course before I went into the military, and I was ready for a responsibility at church. I got in home. They needed staff person on the staff at First United Methodist Church in Fort Worth. It's a sizable church, excellent membership, minister, choir, and all that. So I spent 3 years there, and that was probably as meaningful to me as a seminary education, getting to know so much and do a great deal that way. Okay, where did I go after First Methodist Church? Went to a place down close to Waco, Mart. And Mart was a marvelous appointment. I enjoyed that. Stayed there 4 years, could have stayed longer. Then I was sent to a church in Weatherford, and I appreciated the people at Weatherford. In fact, I wasn't at a place that I didn't appreciate, went to. Then I went from there and stayed 6 years in a country town at Hamilton, down in Central Texas. And never a finer group of people lived in a small town than at Hamilton. And so I stayed there and appreciated that work very much. And eventually came back into Fort Worth and began to raise my family. I came to St. Luke Church. Was in a building program there. I appreciated what I could do at St. Luke. And then I served at the Polytechnic Church there in East Fort Worth. And then after serving there, where did I go? Well, I served 2 more churches in Fort Worth. And then when that was over, I became a staff member for my church, that is in the general church. I was based in Fort Worth, but I had a 6-year responsibility in administrative work with the church. And then the time went on, and time came to retire. I served a church over in North Texas for a while. I was at Commerce, East Texas. Mm-hmm. Lovely appointment. Had the university there, East Texas State. And I was not a bookworm, but I sure enjoyed good books. And I could get over there and get behind in those book rolls, and nobody could ever find me. And I could do some reading and enjoyed it that way. So I retired and moved to Fort Worth, and that's where I've been related to a church, and out in Haltom City. Well, been in the church there for, it's First Methodist Church, Haltom City. I stayed there I'm still there.
That's still your church?
Yeah. So it's been a good life, and I've often said if I had life to live over, I would do it again.
Well, I want to go back and ask you a few questions about it if we could. You gave me a nice overview there, but some of the things that came to mind as I heard you talk about your story early on, when did you feel like you got the call to go into ministry? When did you know that ministry was something that you wanted to do?
Mine was no big to-do. That is, I didn't see a streak of lightning across the sky that tells you to go preach. Mine was sort of a gradual feeling. I just got into it because that was what I wanted to do, and I felt like I had a personal relationship with God to respond to the work that I was called to do. And so it was a genuine feeling, a genuine call, and I appreciate so much the fact that I could be in the ministry and serve in such varied ways and circumstances to live. And then I got into, I think I've told you about my education and
You studied at
what I
Sloan.
got in that, yeah.
Well, that decision, once you had your degree from the seminary to go into the chaplaincy, can you talk about that decision and how you came to that decision?
Well, as I'd mentioned before, they do not draft chaplains, and that was all right. But I went into the chaplaincy of the Army because I'd had extensive experience in high school with ROTC. I kind of went up in the echelons of it, and I thought since that experience that was there, I would probably do a better job as an Army chaplain since I'd had some of that basic information. And I guess that's the way it was. But I went in, the church, all churches had a chaplain's commission, and you could not volunteer for the chaplaincy unless you had the recommendation of that commission. And I went to Chicago and met the Commission on Chaplains of the Methodist Church, and they recommended me, and that's when the Army took me in as a chaplain.
Now, when you got to Europe, that's a long way from Dallas, Fort Worth. So what'd you think when you got to Europe?
Let's get with it, fella. That was my feeling all along, you know, this is great. But once I got in there and things were pretty hot, I said, well, what are you doing over here? And said to myself, well, you volunteered to come. So since you volunteered to come and you're assigned to a good outfit, they've given you promotions as you move along, so let's get with it. So that's the way it was.
Do you remember where you were when that reality set in?
Yeah.
This is just not a vacation. This is...
Oh yeah, that reality set in when I was with the 11th Engineer Combat Group, stationed there near Eisenach, near the Buchenwald concentration camp. But I've never regretting having been sent to this engineer combat group. They were all such wonderful guys, and they put me through friendship and care and things of that nature. And I got homesick. Some of them were homesick too. In fact, homesickness was almost 100%. And I was at Marburg when hostilities ceased, and they signed the treaties in that area. So then after I was there, I was sent down to Stuttgart after the war was over, and I became a chaplain with an outfit in Stuttgart, Germany.
Well, now in that earlier period, while the war was still going on, while the war was still being fought, can you give us an idea of what your daily duties were? I know there wasn't necessarily a normal day, but what were some of the things that you were doing during the day?
Main thing, since the war, for about the last 30 to 60 days before the war was over, everybody knew things were winding down. The days of the strength of the German army were limited. We knew that. So our thoughts began to be on transition, of ending things and getting back home. And everybody wanted to go home, which is natural. And so that's about the way it was. Things were changing so much, men coming and going, and so you had personal problems to deal with. I dealt with some of my own, and till I could come home and get back, looking forward so much to getting home and getting back in the church. And I had homesickness just like anybody else did. And I really went through a spiritual concern at that time, because I said to myself, here you are, a man of God, a chaplain, and you're really thinking about wanting to go home. Why can't you handle that yourself now? And that was something hard to handle. And I did discussed it with others and found out that just about everybody was the same way. And so then the time came when I was separated from service and came on home.
Well, when you were in the field and you were with the combat group, combat engineering group, what did you see as kind of the most important function or the most important role that you served during that period?
Well, by the nature of the chaplain's job, he was not put in positions of danger. Now, some were there, and I was for a little while, but they wanted chaplains back where they could be contacted and deal with men, pull them back, and plan for worship services, and have all of the things that would be of help to the men in service, so when they could come. And that's about the way it was. I was never shot at. I don't know very many chaplains who were, though I had one good friend in the chaplaincy who was hit by an 88, and it was a terrible thing in his death, but that's the way it was. You did what you could where you were.
Well, one of your experiences that I would like for you to kind of walk us through and spend some time with is, you already mentioned Buchenwald, and if you could just take us through that. And I know it's going to be difficult to talk about, but it's important that we get it recorded. And so, if you don't mind, if you could take us through your experience there.
As I mentioned, the outfit I was with was the 1110th Engineer Combat Group, and we had moved up to Eisenach in that period of transition. And while I was at Eisenach, we were there about 30 days, I guess. I had heard that there was a death camp. We didn't know much about concentration camps or death camps, and neither did the German people. You've often heard it said that the German leadership kept these camps quiet as they could, away from people. and they did a pretty good job of it. Some of the German people I got to know quite well after the war, I'm convinced, were not fully aware of what those camps were. And so I wanted to, I heard there's one close by to Eisenach, excuse me, and this was no organized effort. In fact, there was nothing organized much right after the war because it was all dispersed. So I decided I'd go nearby, about 15 miles away, to this place they called a death camp or a concentration camp. And I didn't know much what to find. It was strictly an informal visit. A person wearing captain's bars could go most any place, and chaplains were given commissions. And so I thought, well, I'll go down and see about this place. And my Jeep driver and I drove down there, and we parked near the front entrance, and I started over toward the front. I knew I could go in because I had my chaplain's bars, and before I got to the front entrance, there was a young fella came up to me speaking perfect English. It looked like he was about 15 or 16 years old. He was too young to have been in the German army. And he said, I see you have cross on your lapel. Are you a chaplain? I said, yes. He said, think you could do us a favor? I said, well, I could try. It turned out that this person that was talking to me was the young fella, Eliezer Wiesel, who's known better today as Elie Wiesel. There have been documentaries on his life. Well, he didn't know me from Adam, and same thing. I just knew I was meeting a young fella, and I was 6 or 8 years older than he, and he was too young to go into the German army, and I was too young to really be a chaplain, but I was there anyhow. And he says, could you do something for us? And I said, well, I'll do my best if I can help you. And he said, first of all, I'd like to take you through some parts of the camp here. And I didn't know what that meant, because I didn't go there for any formal take-through. They didn't have any formal. Those had not developed as yet. But went through the main entrance. I remember that well. And walked in, and as you've heard the expression, dead men walking. That's the way I don't like to use the word inmate, don't like to use the word residents. That's where the people who were in the concentration camp looked. I went to several of them, some who could speak English, and I'd talk a little bit with them. I planned a worship service for them. A chaplain had many different things, ways to put things together. So I planned a Jewish worship service for those in the Buchenwald death camp who wanted to come, so many of them had wanted nothing to do with religion, but those who were genuine in their faith, and there was the opportunity to come to a worship service, they came. And I met with them several times on services. But I remember the first time, we got our carry-alls, those big trucks, and put people who could be carried in those things to a place where we could have a worship service. They had to be lifted on, had to be carried on, crying. They never thought they'd be alive. Many of them had been there and not knowing too much about their past because they'd always been under some kind of care and concentration. But we got them in the carry-alls and took them to the place of worship. And I was in charge of the worship service. And we had some little prayer books. I wish I had mine now, that were distributed among those that wanted them. And on one side of it was Hebrew prayers. The other side was English. So as they went through the service in Hebrew, then I could follow along in English itself. They cried, they shouted. When they got through, they just raising hands, sort of like our Pentecostals today they were just raising their hands in joy and appreciation. They didn't think they'd ever see that again. They didn't think they'd be alive, but that was it. And I didn't think much about doing that, because that's regular work of a chaplain. You were trained and equipped to do certain things. But I did them, got through, went back to my outfit, kept on going in the chaplaincy with what I was doing. So later on I began to think, well, there's more to this than just what you went through. So I've read a lot of stuff on Buchenwald and other things that were there. And I would not go through it again. I'm glad to have had the opportunity at one time. But it began to have a slow working thing on me, which has been a lifelong circumstance. And there are times when it's been almost too heavy to bear, but then you keep on going. You do.
I know you're a man of faith, and so I'd be interested to know, as you've thought about your faith, and you've talked about it, your kind of your own spiritual journey, as you think about that experience within your larger spiritual journey, I mean, how do you think about it?
First thing I thought about was, first thing that came in was one of guilt. Now, you've had the kind of faith which you have told yourself will hold up to anything. You had the kind of expression to yourself with the idea that you can face anything. Okay, old boy, you have faced something you can't handle. Now what are you going to do? Well, it was a spiritual struggle, but I said to myself, and I didn't want to come to you or anybody else and say, you know, my faith isn't strong enough to bear this. I was guilty. I felt guilty. I didn't have the kind of faith I should have. But nonetheless, I went through it. And but the feeling at that time was I didn't have the faith, but yet I did. And went through it, came out of it, and have continued. And I still have, I don't say they're flashbacks, but I go back to that time of why couldn't you handle it? And the main thing that I could do is get back home and get to work, deal with people, prepare sermons, preach them, just to be a part of what you were meant to begin with.
Do you mind sharing other memories you have? You said you had the opportunity to have conversations with some of those in the camp in English, and I know there were other sites that you saw in the camp. If you can share a little bit of that.
My conversations at Buchenwald were rather limited. As I said, there were no formal tours of going through, and they didn't try to organize people to bring them in and let them see. That was before all that happened. I was dealing with men, looking at them, almost 100% of whom could not speak English. And they're looking at me, and I was a chaplain, a man of God. What could I do for them? And there wasn't much I could do. I still carry that feeling of inadequacy when I was there with them and had been presented with a situation that my faith said, okay, here you are now. What can you do with it? What are you doing with it? And so I felt like I couldn't do much with it. And did I depend on the grace of God? Yes. God's grace was present then, even though I couldn't feel it the way I should. It was there, and it's been with me ever since that time.
Now, as you went through the camp, you talked about seeing the people. Were there other things that you saw while you were in the camp that I know you now know about the layout and what was there at Buchenwald and that sort of thing?
Yes. There was a room about not quite as big as this room. The ceilings were higher. But this room had pegs in it about where the ceiling is in this room. Those pegs were about 6 or 8 feet apart. They were heavy pegs. There were little stools around. They would bring the German people in there and put them on those stools and put ropes around their necks and have them there. Maybe, I didn't count the number of places there were, but I guess at one time maybe they could exterminate 40 or 50 people, kick those stools out from underneath them. I've never tried to let myself imagine what it looked like to see all those people. Struggling and trying to live. I didn't see it, but my imagination was there. And anyway, that was a killing room. They would take them over to ovens on one side of the room and put the bodies in there and exterminate them. They did away with them there. This is where they killed people. It's where they burned their bodies. And of course, when I got there, it wasn't happening anymore. We'd stopped all of that, but nonetheless, some of the circumstances were there.
Did you know how after the camp had been liberated when you got there?
Oh, some people had left. 2 weeks. There was no organized closing of the camp, as I tried to mention a while ago. There was nothing organized, and people could come and go, inmates, but most of them had no place to go. And so that's the way it was. I didn't try to organize any circumstance of dismissing them because that just couldn't be done. I wasn't the one to do it anyway, but later on there was kind of an organized effort to see that they could get where they want. But so many had no place to go. We had to take care of them, and I'm not sure how we did it all, but they had no families to go to.
Was there military medical personnel there as well?
I'm sure they all, from our standpoint, we took care of the most extreme cases, and then gradually were able to take care of those that were not so bad.
I know that the condition they're in, several of them lost their life while you were there, I would imagine. Did you have any responsibilities?
No.
With last rites? Or
no. They did not want GIs. They did not want those of us with the military to take care of anything of civilians. There were ministers. There were ways. They were still there. There were ways of dealing with their own dead and their own people of need.
You mentioned meeting Elie Wiesel, and he asked if you could do them a favor. Was the favor see the camp? What was or was it the worship service?
Worship service.
The worship service.
He just simply told me, says, we can provide everything that's needed except a place and the ability to get there. I said, okay, I'll take care of that. You take care of the worship service. And that's what we did. The place of meeting was a large Protestant church there in Eisenach. And we brought them in those carryalls. They were still amazed and blank looks on their faces. Some of them, I'm sure, got on the carryalls and went not even knowing what was going to be happening. And
it had to be such a powerful worship service.
yeah, oh yeah, it was. And I went to 2 or 3 worship services. Went over to see that they went all right.
So now you said you came back to your unit and you went on, and was it from there you went to Stuttgart?
Stuttgart.
Okay. And if you can give me, I know after the war's over, you're in Stuttgart there at headquarters. And so at that time, are you kind of counseling soldiers are there? What sort of work are you doing at that time?
He just got into the mix match of everything,
Okay.
all changing so much. We'd have worship services. We would requisition sanctuaries, and we'd let the German people come if they wanted to. But it's the first time in my life that I'd gotten one of those tall pulpit areas, looking down on the people, preaching to them. But that's what they appreciated, what they wanted, so that's what we did.
Do you remember, and this is a really hard question, but do you remember any of the messages or the themes of the messages that you were sharing at that time?
I didn't save any of my notes. Wish I had them. But I dwelt on God's love now. God's love with you, whatever your circumstance. He has not left you because of what all's going on. God is personally with you. I didn't ask for decisions. That was rather difficult to do in the Army. But you just hope and pray that if some people were to decide to live closer to God and their Christian faith, that they would do so in the silence of their hearts and minds. And I kind of feel like they did.
But that comment you made, it was hard to do in the Army, ask for decisions. Can you talk about that?
Well, for the most part, you just held worship services. And you let it be known that any time, day or night, wherever you were open to discuss whatever concerns might be with you. So you were open at all times, not simply the chaplain, but there were some other people that would be that way. I think we covered a pretty good relationship of meeting the needs of the GIs in that way.
Do you remember some of those, when you were in Europe, some of those talks with GIs that stood out to you, that would come to you for?
Yeah. They were almost all on the same vein. That is, I need to go home. I want to go home. And as I say, I was one of them that had the same feeling. So that was, but you could get away from that thought, but nonetheless, that's pretty well what they came with. Mm-hmm. I need to get out. I've got wife, I've got children, I've got a job. Now that the war is over, I don't need to be here. And I said, I understand you. But that didn't happen in the military. You stayed with it.
Yeah. Well, did you get to rub elbows with any of the upper brass while you were there in Stuttgart?
I think that probably the closest I was to anybody of note of anyone of any circumstance was a fellow by the name of Martin Niemöller. He was quite well known as a German leader, and he had something to do with the time of Hitler's life. And Niemöller had come against Hitler that way, and I went. He was to speak. This was in where was it? It was Stuttgart, I guess. And the sanctuary of the church, which was moderate size, was filled to capacity. And I came in and went right down to the front, sitting on the front row, not even seats, but just rows. And he was speaking just like that, and I just there listening to it. So that was the closest I got to someone who had extreme capability at that time. I don't suppose that I'm sure there were casual contacts in some way, but in an outstanding way, I can't say there was.
Well, I know you were anxious to get home, so when did you get to return? You talk about your return, but
not soon enough. But I came home because all of this was in 1945, and all of it took place within 30 to 60 days, I'd say, from the time of the end of the war to the time you had a chance to come home. And so there wasn't anything spectacular about it. I came home, was married, and I don't suppose a GI's wife could be any closer than my wife was. She was plain steady, and I know she tried to bake cookies and send them to me. The time they get to me, it'd be all dry and powdery and stuff, but we'd still appreciate what she was doing. There were some GIs who were pretty well heavy in guilt. They were going home now, and they had, the idea of preserving yourself bodily was pretty well passé. I mean, there wasn't anything to it. As you left the orderly room, there'd be a box of condoms. Get you some of those. Put them in your pocket. Have them handy. Every GI was expected to, when he left there, and there'd be a map as to where certain ones that you could go to and stay away from because they were diseased and didn't want too much disease to come around. And I know one time I was doing my best to talk to my guys in my outfit. I guess there were about 200 or 300 of them gathered in one room. And what could I say to help them to get home for their wives in a meaningful way, that is, having kept themselves? And I didn't ask people that, but I really bore down on it. And the colonel of the outfit asked me to come into his room. And he was a good guy. I appreciate him very much. And he says, Chappie, I know where you're coming from, but don't bear down too heavy. These guys have been through everything that you can imagine. And says, go ahead and be the one that relates to them and help them, but don't condemn them to hell because of what they've done. Boy, he had a point there. I thought of that one time when I was in Paris on leave. You could, after the war was over, you could get leave to go most any place for a brief time, maybe a week or so. And I went into Paris, two of us together. We were walking down the street, past the lady, and she came up to me just almost imploring to have sex with her. And the one thing that they were doing, not simply for gratification on their part or giving the GI gratification, but they were needing money to buy food to live. And I had a bit different feeling about what that was and what it meant. And I think there was a forgiving spirit with God with some of those people and what they were having to go through to live.
As you think about when you returned and you talked about getting back and preparing sermons and working in a church, that particular experience that you had in Buchenwald, what do you think, how do you think that affected what sort of man the cloth that you were?
For a long time, you wouldn't let it affect you. You almost wanted to eliminate that period of time in your life that was there and just get back into where you had been and what you were doing. But it did, the effect was there. And I pretty well kept it, the experiences and feelings down until one time just sort of exploded and came out, you know. Now for me to define what that exploding and coming out meant is rather difficult. But it changed everything, your outlook on life and your doing. I know I wanted to quit, get out of the ministry for a time because of not being able to stand up to those things the way I felt like I should. And but eventually I came to terms with it. Had to come to terms with it. And I accepted the fact that it happened. It was the only way I could do it. I couldn't deny the fact. I accepted it. It did happen. I was participating in it, and this is what it did to you.
Well, I thought as you were saying that, you know, there are those that want to deny the whole event happened. And it's interesting you just talking about going through, personally going through that process.
Yeah, I think you have to do that. At least I did. For a while I wouldn't do it. Wouldn't even think about it. I wouldn't necessarily stand up and say, I'm not going to talk about this. I just wouldn't talk about it. But once I got through that negative feeling, it's been a blessing to me that I have, and it's been a blessing to many people. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned to you, I've gone around to schools and talked on some of the experiences, and I've been thankful I could.
When you get a chance to talk to a school or something, what do you want to let them? What do you want to make sure you let them know about that?
And this is a rather, it's a very important point, but you've got to refer to yourself as having been there and experienced that, without trying to put yourself on a pedestal and say, look what I've done. But you've got to say to in some respects, here's a fella that is flesh and blood, and he's experienced many of the things you read about in your textbooks. Now I want you to ask questions of me, because here I am, flesh and blood, in front of you, and I want you to open up. And they did pretty well.
Well, I'd be interested to know, what do kids usually ask? What do they ask about?
Well, in the first place, they never can put themselves in the position you're in. And their questions had to do mainly, well, okay, you've gone through it and you're back home. Well, how you doing back home now? You got a job? How's your wife doing? That type of thing. Mm-hmm. Because they could never put themselves in the position of having experienced those things.
Yeah.
And I don't know how adequately I've done it, but I've done it.
Well, that's why we are here to hear it in your words, because we can't put ourselves in that position.
Yeah.
So is there something I should have asked you that I didn't ask you about?
I don't know. I think that's covered it pretty well. And I think I would tell you if I thought there was something you should ask. But, no, that's pretty well it.
Reverend Canafax, I want to thank you for your time today. I want to thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you.